Below the thrumming, chaotic streets of New York City lies a hidden world of forgotten steel, damp concrete, and perpetual darkness. It is a subterranean labyrinth that most people pretend doesn't exist. But for 34-year-old Abigail Preston, the echoing chambers of an abandoned subway spur became her only sanctuary. Just 8 months earlier, she was sipping vintage Cabernet in a sprawling Tribeca penthouse, completely unaware that her husband of 7 years was methodically stripping away her wealth, her reputation, and her sanity. When she finally hit rock bottom, Abigail didn't just fall through the cracks of society, she built an impenetrable fortress inside them. Abigail Preston had spent her entire adult life building things. As a lead architect for a mid-sized Manhattan firm, she specialized in taking derelict, forgotten spaces and transforming them into breathtaking, modern environments. She had an eye for structure, a talent for seeing the potential hidden behind decaying facades. Ironically, she was completely blind to the decaying facade of her own marriage. Her husband, Richard Sullivan, was a private wealth manager who exuded an aura of untouchable success. He wore tailored Italian suits, charmed her colleagues at gallery openings, and managed their finances with a dismissive wave of his hand, always insisting, "Let me handle the numbers, Abby. You just keep making the city beautiful." For 7 years, it was a partnership that felt as solid as bedrock. The collapse didn't happen with a dramatic explosion. It started with a quiet, insidious erosion. It was a brisk Tuesday in November. Abigail was standing at the counter of a boutique coffee shop in Soho, waiting to pay for a perfectly mundane latte. She tapped her platinum credit card against the reader. It beeped aggressively, declined. She frowned, offering a polite apology to the barista, and handed over a different card tied to their joint checking account. Declined. A cold knot of confusion tightened in her stomach. She stepped outside into the biting wind and dialed Richard's cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. She called his office. His receptionist, a usually bubbly woman named Diane, sounded tense, her voice tight and clipped as she informed Abigail that Richard hadn't come into the office for 2 days. When Abigail arrived back at their Tribeca penthouse, the lock on the heavy oak door wouldn't turn. Her key jammed. Before she could call the super, the door swung open from the inside, revealing not her husband, but a man in a cheap gray suit holding a clipboard. Behind him, 2 other men were systematically placing red tags on her furniture, her artwork, her life. "Mrs. Sullivan?" the man asked, looking at a printed document. "I'm with the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. We're here to secure the assets of this property in connection with the ongoing investigation into Sullivan Wealth Management." The next 48 hours were a blur of blinding panic and sickening revelations. Richard was gone. He hadn't just boarded a flight. He had meticulously erased himself. Abigail's lawyer, a tough-talking veteran named Gregory Fiske, laid out the catastrophic reality across a mahogany conference table. Richard had been running an elaborate Ponzi scheme for years. When the walls began to close in, he executed a masterclass in financial sabotage. He had forged Abigail's signature on a mountain of high-interest loans, leveraged their penthouse, liquidated her personal savings, and drained her business accounts. He had funneled millions into untraceable offshore accounts and vanished, leaving a trail of fabricated evidence that painted Abigail as a silent, complicit partner. "He used your architectural firm as a shell for laundering the funds, Abby," Gregory explained, pushing a stack of heavily redacted bank statements toward her. "He funneled the money through invoices for phantom construction materials. The feds are looking at you not as a victim, but as a flight risk and a co-conspirator." Abigail's accounts were frozen, pending the federal investigation. Her firm fired her to distance themselves from the scandal. The friends they had hosted for lavish dinners suddenly stopped answering her calls. Chloe Davies, a woman Abigail had considered her closest confidant since college, blocked her number after sending a brief, agonizingly cold text. "I'm sorry, Abby. I can't be dragged into this. My husband's career could be compromised." By December, the eviction notice was enforced. With no access to cash, her credit score decimated, and a looming federal indictment casting a toxic shadow over her name, Abigail found herself standing on a freezing Manhattan sidewalk with 2 suitcases. She had $24 in her purse. The descent into homelessness is a brutal, dehumanizing process that strips away a person's dignity layer by layer. The first week, Abigail slept on a hard plastic chair in the waiting room of an all-night emergency clinic until security caught on and forced her out. The second week, she navigated the terrifying labyrinth of the city's shelter system. It was at the Bedford Women's Shelter that the reality of her new life truly set in. On her third night there, a violent altercation broke out over a stolen blanket. In the chaos, someone slashed Abigail's duffel bag and stole her remaining clothes, her heavy winter coat, and the silver locket her mother had given her. She sat on her cot, shivering in a thin sweater, the smell of bleach, unwashed bodies, and despair pressing heavily against her lungs. She realized with terrifying clarity that the system wouldn't protect her. Richard had designed her ruin so perfectly that society viewed her as a criminal who got what she deserved. If she stayed in the light, she would be crushed either by the courts, the streets, or the freezing winter. She needed to disappear. She needed a place where the rules of the city didn't apply. And as she sat there in the dim, flickering light of the shelter, her architect's mind began to work, pulling up a memory of a project bid from 3 years ago, a memory that would become her lifeline. Years prior, Abigail's firm had been contracted by the city to assess the structural integrity of a series of decommissioned subway tunnels deep beneath the Lower East Side. The city had vague dreams of turning them into a subterranean park, a project that was ultimately scrapped due to lack of funding. During the assessment, Abigail had studied the original blueprints from the 1930s. She had memorized the winding, forgotten arteries of the city. More importantly, she remembered a specific anomaly, an old maintenance substation located off a dead-end spur that had been sealed off from the main tracks in 1968. It was technically city property, but it was entirely off the grid, hidden behind 50 feet of collapsed rubble and forgotten by the Metropolitan Transportation Authority. It was dangerous, it was illegal, but it was empty. At 2 a.m. on a freezing Thursday in January, Abigail made her move. She spent her last few dollars on a heavy-duty flashlight and a pair of thick leather work gloves from a 2-4-hour hardware store. Dressed in layers of scavenged, ill-fitting clothing, she navigated to a desolate industrial block near the Williamsburg Bridge. According to her memory of the blueprints, the entrance wasn't through a station, but through an emergency ventilation grate hidden in an overgrown, fenced-off alleyway between 2 abandoned warehouses. Getting over the chain-link fence tore a jagged gash in her jeans and scraped her knee raw, but she pushed through the pain, driven by a primal need for shelter. She found the grate. It was heavy, rusted solid to its iron frame. She used a discarded piece of rebar as a lever, throwing her entire body weight against it. For 10 minutes, nothing happened. Just as she was about to collapse from exhaustion, the rust broke with a sharp crack, and the heavy iron swung upward on its ancient hinges. A blast of stale, metallic-smelling air rushed up from the darkness below. It smelled of ozone, damp earth, and decades of silence. Abigail clicked on her flashlight, aiming the beam downward. A rusted steel ladder descended into a seemingly bottomless concrete shaft. She climbed down. The descent took agonizing minutes. Her frozen fingers ached as they gripped the icy rungs. When her boots finally hit solid ground, she was standing in a massive, vaulted tunnel. In the distance, she could hear the faint, rhythmic rumble of an active subway line, the vibration traveling through the bedrock. But this specific corridor was dead. Dust motes danced in the beam of her flashlight. The walls were lined with decaying ceramic tiles and thick, snaking cables, coated in decades of grime. She walked for nearly a mile, navigating by memory and architectural instinct. She stepped carefully over rusted tracks, avoiding pools of stagnant, black water. The darkness was absolute. It felt heavy, almost liquid. Finally, she reached the cave-in she remembered from the reports. A massive pile of concrete and twisted rebar blocked the main tunnel, but Abigail knew the secret. To the left of the rubble, hidden behind a false wall of corrugated steel that looked like debris, was a heavy iron door. She squeezed behind the steel plating and found the door handle. It was stiff, but it turned. She pushed her way inside and swept her flashlight across her new domain. It was an old crew quarters and tool room, roughly 20 by 15 feet. The air here was surprisingly dry, thanks to a passive ventilation shaft that ran up to the surface. Old steel lockers lined one wall. A heavy wooden workbench sat in the center. In the corner, incredibly, was a cast-iron utility sink connected to a forgotten municipal water line. She turned the rusted knob of the sink. A loud groan echoed through the pipes, followed by a violent sputtering. And then, a stream of brown water flowed out. After a minute, it ran clear. Abigail sank to the floor, her back against the cold concrete, and did something she hadn't done since the day she found the eviction notice on her door. She cried. They were massive, racking sobs of relief. She had water, she had walls, she had a door that locked from the inside. Over the next few months, Abigail Preston transformed from a terrified fugitive into an underground pioneer. Survival required absolute discipline and extreme caution. She became a ghost of the city above. She slept during the day, wrapped in thick thermal blankets she slowly acquired from discarded donation bins. At night, she emerged onto the surface to scavenge. She became an expert at dumpster diving behind high-end grocery stores and construction sites. The waste of New York City was staggering. She found perfectly good, sealed food tossed out due to minor packaging dents and discarded building materials that she dragged down the shaft piece by piece. Her architectural skills proved invaluable. She found rolls of discarded fiberglass insulation at a high-rise construction site and spent weeks lining the walls of her room to trap body heat. She scavenged deep-cycle marine batteries from a boatyard dumpster in Brooklyn, wiring them to scavenged LED light strips to give her room a warm, functional glow without the risk of an open flame. She built a bed frame out of discarded shipping pallets and found a nearly new foam mattress leaning against a dumpster in the West Village. She even managed to tap into a live electrical line running through the main tunnel. It was incredibly dangerous. One slip could have electrocuted her, but using thick rubber gloves and scavenged copper wire, she managed to siphon a tiny trickle of power into her room, enough to keep her batteries charged and run a small hot plate she had found at a flea market. By April, her space was no longer just a concrete box. It was a home. It was bizarrely cozy. She had taped up discarded magazines and found art to cover the water stains. She had a neatly organized pantry of canned goods. She had rigged a privacy curtain over her bathroom corner, where a bucket system managed her waste. Down here, she didn't have to think about Richard. She didn't have to think about the FBI agents combing through her life, or the lawyers arguing over debts she didn't accrue. The rhythmic, distant rumble of the active subway lines became a comforting heartbeat. She was safe. But isolation plays tricks on the human mind. The absolute silence between the train rumbles began to stretch. Abigail started to notice things she hadn't paid attention to during her frantic first weeks of survival. She noticed that a specific pile of rubble near the entrance of her spur seemed to shift slightly from week to week. She found a discarded cigarette butt near the iron door of her room, a brand she didn't smoke. And then, one Tuesday, in late May, she woke up to a sound that made her blood run cold. It wasn't the rumble of a train. It wasn't the squeak of a tunnel rat. It was the distinct, heavy sound of footsteps echoing on the concrete directly outside her reinforced iron door. Someone else was down here, and they had stopped right outside her home. The heavy footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the noise. Abigail held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She slowly reached for the heavy iron rebar she kept beside her pallet. She crept toward the door, her bare feet making no sound on the icy concrete. Then came the knock. It wasn't the frantic pounding of a police raid or the aggressive banging of an intruder. It was a rhythmic, almost polite tap. Shave and a haircut, 2 cents. I can smell the Folgers, lady. A raspy, gravelly voice echoed through the heavy steel of the door. and I can see the light bleeding through the bottom hinge. You're wasting your battery power. Turn off the inverter before the transit authority detects the hum." Abigail froze. Her hand trembled on the latch. If this was the police, they wouldn't knock like that. If it was a predator, he wouldn't be giving her advice about her electrical setup. Taking a deep, ragged breath, she gripped the rebar tightly in her right hand and unbolted the heavy deadbolt with her left. She pulled the door open just an inch. Standing in the beam of her flashlight was a man who looked like he had been carved out of the tunnel walls. He was in his late 50s, his face lined with deep crevices of grime and weathered skin. He wore a faded, oversized canvas coat and an incredibly old, reflective orange MTA safety vest that had turned a dull rust color. In his hand, he held a sophisticated thermal imaging scanner, the kind used by structural engineers. "Lower the pipe, architect," he said, his pale blue eyes squinting against her flashlight. "If I wanted to hurt you, I would have done it 3 weeks ago, when you dragged that mattress down the ventilation shaft. You make a hell of a lot of noise for someone trying to be a ghost." Abigail didn't lower the rebar. "Who are you?" "Name's Silas Caldwell," he replied, leaning against the cold, tiled wall of the corridor. "Former structural engineer for the Metropolitan Transportation Authority. Fired in '09, lost my pension in a bad hedge fund collapse. Now, I'm the unofficial superintendent of the F-Line Spur. And you're Abigail Preston, the penthouse pariah, if I'm quoting the New York Post correctly." Abigail's blood ran cold. The surface world had found her. She braced herself to fight, to run, to disappear deeper into the dark. But Silas just sighed and lowered his thermal scanner. "Relax. I don't care about the federal bounty on your head, and I sure as hell don't care about the FBI." Silas grunted, pulling a crushed pack of peppermints from his pocket and popping one into his mouth. "But I do care about my neighborhood, and you are about to get us both evicted." He explained that the city was beginning a massive subterranean structural survey ahead of the new Essex Crossing development project. Within 48 hours, an MTA tracked geometry car, followed by a manual inspection crew armed with acoustic and thermal scanners, was scheduled to sweep this exact forgotten spur. "They're looking for microfractures in the bedrock," Silas explained, stepping into a room uninvited and looking around with an approving nod. "But what they're going to find is a glowing 90-degree heat signature radiating from your rigged-up marine batteries and a perfect acoustic hollow behind this rubble. When they find you, they find me. And I've lived down here for a decade. I'm not going back to the surface." Abigail finally lowered the rebar. The paralyzing fear was suddenly replaced by something she hadn't felt in months: professional clarity. She was an architect. Spatial problem-solving was her native language. "Thermal and acoustic," Abigail muttered, her mind racing as she looked at her scavenged walls. "The fiberglass insulation I put up traps the heat, but it doesn't mask the signature, and the hollow space behind the steel door acts like a drum for their acoustic sonar." "Exactly," Silas said. "So, pack your bags. We have to move down to the lower aqueduct levels until they pass." "No," Abigail said firmly. The sudden authority in her voice surprised them both. "If we leave, they'll still find the room. They'll seal the shaft, and we lose this space forever. We don't run, we camouflage." For the next 48 hours, the Tribeca architect and the subterranean engineer worked in a frantic, synchronized frenzy. Silas knew every forgotten stockpile of materials in the underground system. Abigail knew exactly how to use them. They hauled heavy sheets of lead-lined drywall scavenged from an abandoned X-ray wing demolition at a nearby hospital down the shaft, layering it against the inner walls of her room to block the thermal bleed of her batteries. To counter the acoustic sonar, Abigail used her knowledge of sound wave disruption. They gathered hundreds of discarded egg cartons and heavy, damp canvas tarps, packing them into the negative space between the iron door and the rubble cave-in. She designed an acoustic baffle, a geometric arrangement of debris that would scatter the sonar waves rather than reflect them back to the MTA equipment. On Thursday morning, the rumble of the inspection car vibrated through the floorboards. Abigail and Silas sat in total darkness inside her room, the power cut, breathing shallowly. The heavy, mechanical grinding of the MTA crew echoed right outside their door. Men in hard hats were shouting over the noise of the machines, getting a weird echo off this rubble pile. A muffled voice yelled just inches away from the iron door. Abigail closed her eyes, preparing for the sound of sledgehammers. "It's just scattered debris," another voice yelled back. "Sonar says it's solid bedrock right behind it. Thermal is dead cold. Mark it clear and let's keep moving. We got 3 more miles to cover." The footsteps faded. The heavy machinery rolled away. Abigail and Silas sat in the pitch black, the profound silence slowly returning to the tunnel. Silas clicked his flashlight back on. He looked at Abigail, a genuine smile cracking his grime-covered face. "Well, Preston, you're not just a fancy decorator after all. You're one of us now." Summer hit the surface world like a sledgehammer, turning the concrete canyons of Manhattan into a sweltering oven. But down in the F-line spur, the ambient temperature remained a steady, damp 60 degrees. Months passed. The alliance between Abigail and Silas deepened into a fierce, unspoken loyalty. He taught her how to navigate the electrified third rails safely and how to read the cryptic graffiti tags that served as a map for the underground denizens. In return, she organized his chaotic stockpiles and helped reinforce the structural integrity of his own hidden encampment near the Delancey Street station. But surviving wasn't enough anymore. The sheer adrenaline of outsmarting the MTA inspectors had awakened something dormant inside Abigail. The crushing depression and victimhood had burned away, leaving behind a cold, hard ember of absolute rage. Richard had stolen her life. She wanted it back. "I need to know what's happening up there," Abigail told Silas one evening as they shared a tin of scavenged peaches. "I need to know what the FBI found and what Richard is doing. I need the internet." Silas chuckled, a dry, coughing sound. "Wi-Fi doesn't exactly bounce off bedrock, Abby, but there is a guy. We call him the mayor. He lives deep down near the old City Hall loop. He's crazy, but he's connected." The journey to the City Hall loop took hours. They navigated narrow maintenance shafts, waded through knee-deep water that smelled of sulfur, and bypassed active subway tracks by clinging to the greasy walls as trains roared past inches from their backs. Finally, they emerged onto a beautifully ornate, arched platform illuminated by the eerie blue glow of computer monitors. This was the legendary decommissioned City Hall station, its vaulted tile ceilings a masterpiece of early 1900s architecture. In the center of the platform sat Arthur Penhaligon. Arthur was a former cybersecurity analyst for a major Wall Street firm who had suffered a catastrophic mental breakdown a decade ago. He sat in a rolling office chair, surrounded by a Frankenstein server rack, powered by a dangerous, direct tap into a municipal utility line. He had physically spliced into a major fiber optic trunk line that ran through the subway tunnels to the financial district. "Silas," Arthur muttered without looking away from his screens. "And the architect. I saw you on the digital wire. The feds are still freezing your assets. Nasty business." "I need a terminal, Arthur," Abigail said, stepping into the glow of the monitors. "Just for an hour. I can pay you in D-cell batteries and a carton of unopened medical-grade sterile wipes I found." Arthur's eyes lit up. "Sterile wipes. Deal. Terminal 3. Sitting down at the jury-rigged laptop, Abigail's fingers flew across the keyboard. She bypassed the standard search engines, using Arthur's encrypted VPNs to dig into federal court dockets, offshore financial registries, and high-society gossip blogs. It took 45 minutes to find the thread. It was a seemingly innocuous photo posted on a private, geo-tagged Instagram account belonging to a Russian oligarch. In the background of a lavish party in Limassol, Cyprus, stood a man holding a glass of champagne, laughing. It was Richard. He looked tanned, relaxed, and perfectly untouched by the destruction he had left behind. Bile rose in Abigail's throat, but she forced herself to keep digging. She hacked into the public records of Sullivan Wealth Management's bankruptcy proceedings. The FBI had seized their servers, their hard drives, and millions in assets. But as Abigail read through the federal asset inventory, a glaring realization struck her like a bolt of lightning. The ledger is missing. During the federal hearings, prosecutors repeatedly mentioned an encrypted digital master ledger, the key to unlocking the offshore accounts, but stated it had never been recovered. They assumed Richard had taken it with him or destroyed it on a flash drive. But Abigail knew Richard better than anyone. He was arrogant, but he was also deeply paranoid. He didn't trust digital hardware that could be corrupted by a magnet or lost in a pocket. He trusted architecture. He trusted immovable, physical security. She closed her eyes, visualizing the grand, historic office space she had renovated for him in the iconic Woolworth building 3 years prior. She remembered the blueprints. She remembered the specific demands he had made. "I need a place for my private client files, Abby," he had told her. "Something fireproof, off the grid, totally separate from the firm's main vault." She had designed it perfectly. She had discovered an old, decommissioned pneumatic tube system hidden inside the load-bearing masonry of his executive corner office. She had capped the iron tube off, creating a vertical, drop-safe cavity deep inside the wall that didn't appear on any modern blueprint. It was accessible only by removing a specific, heavy mahogany wainscoting panel behind his desk. Richard hadn't taken the master ledger to Cyprus. It was still in New York. It was sitting inside the wall of a locked, federally seized office on the 42nd floor of the Woolworth building. Abigail logged off the terminal and stood up. The frightened fugitive who had crawled into the dirt 8 months ago was gone. The woman standing on the platform was a woman with a blueprint for a counterstrike. "Did you find what you were looking for?" Silas asked, noticing the dangerous, focused gleam in her eyes. "Yes," Abigail said, her voice terrifyingly calm. "He left the key to his entire empire inside a wall I built, and I am going to tear it down." Silas stared at her. "Abby, that building is locked down. It's crawling with private security and likely monitored by federal agents. You're a wanted woman. You step into the lobby, you go to federal prison." "I'm not going through the lobby, Silas," Abigail said, looking up at the vaulted ceiling of the tunnel. "I'm an architect. I know exactly how to bypass the lobby. We're going to break in from the inside out." She turned back to Arthur. "I need blueprints. Every municipal utility schematic, HVAC, ductwork plan, and freight elevator layout for the Woolworth building from 1913 to present day. Can you pull them?" Arthur grinned, his fingers already dancing across his mechanical keyboard. "Architect, down here, I am God. Give me 10 minutes. Abigail looked at Silas, the dim blue light casting sharp shadows across her face. "I need your help, Silas. We're going back up." The Woolworth building, once the tallest skyscraper in the world, is often called the Cathedral of Commerce. Designed by Cass Gilbert and completed in 1913, its neo-Gothic terracotta facade dominates the lower Manhattan skyline. To the tourists walking along Broadway, it is a magnificent piece of history. To the private security firms that guard its marble-clad lobby, it is a modern fortress. But to Abigail Preston, staring at the century-old blueprints illuminated by Arthur Penhaligon's glowing monitors, it was a porous organism full of forgotten arteries. "The main utility spine," Abigail said, tracing a faded blue line on the screen with a grease-stained finger. When the building was constructed, it had its own power plant in the sub-basement. They used coal. The coal was delivered via a subterranean spur that connected to the old freight tunnels beneath City Hall Park. Arthur leaned in, his eyes wide, tapping a rapid rhythm on his desk. Those coal tunnels were bricked up in the 1950s when they switched to the municipal grid. "Bricked up? Yes, but not backfilled," Abigail corrected, her architectural expertise overriding her exhaustion. "The structural blueprints show a hollow void. If we can get into the old coal chute from the City Hall steam tunnels, we can bypass the modern foundation sensors entirely. From there, it's a straight vertical climb up the decommissioned service elevator shaft that runs behind the central core. It terminates on the 41st floor, right below the executive suites." Silas crossed his arms, his weathered face tight with concern. "A 50-story vertical climb up a rusted elevator shaft? Abby, I'm a tunnel rat, not a mountain climber, and you've been living on scavenged canned beans for 8 months. Do you have any idea the kind of physical endurance that takes? We aren't free climbing, Abigail replied, her voice forged in iron. She turned to Arthur. I need 200 feet of high-tensile paracord, 2 climbing harnesses, and mechanical ascenders. And I need a bypass key for a magnetic maglock system, circa 2018. Arthur grinned, a chaotic gleam in his eye. I can get the gear from an urban exploration crew that owes me a favor. As for the maglock, I'll build you a brute force RFID cloner, but you'll only have a 10-second window before the building's central server registers the anomaly. They spent the next 3 days preparing. Abigail mapped the route with obsessive precision, committing the layout of the Woolworth's 42nd floor to memory. She remembered the plush, oppressive silence of Richard's office. She remembered the smell of his expensive sandalwood cologne that used to linger in the expensive fabric she had chosen for him. The memory didn't bring tears anymore. It brought a cold, clarifying anger. At 1 a.m. on a storm-swept Sunday, Abigail and Silas began their ascent. The entry point was exactly where the 1,913 blueprints promised. Deep beneath City Hall Park, wading through ankle-deep sludge, Silas used a heavy steel sledgehammer to breach a crumbling brick partition hidden behind a rusted steam pipe. They crawled through the jagged opening into absolute, suffocating darkness. The air in the forgotten coal tunnel was thick with a century of undisturbed dust, tasting of bitter carbon and dry rot. They navigated the narrow chute on their hands and knees for nearly 2 hours, guided only by the dim, red-filtered beams of their tactical flashlights. Above them, the rumble of the city was completely silenced. They had crossed the threshold. They were beneath the cathedral. Here, Silas whispered, his voice muffled by his respirator mask. The shaft. Before them, the tunnel opened into a vertical concrete abyss. Heavy steel guide rails, coated in decades of black grease, ran up into the infinite darkness. The air was frigid, whistling down from the heights of the skyscraper. Silas secured the harnesses, anchoring the paracord to a massive steel I-beam. Mechanical ascenders, he instructed, clipping the device onto the rope. You push up, it bites the rope. You stand in the foot loop. Repeat. It's basically doing 1,000 step-ups. Pace yourself, Preston. If you burn out your quads on floor 20, we are dead. The climb was an agonizing exercise in sheer willpower. By the 10th floor, Abigail's shoulders burned with a lactic acid fire. By the 30th floor, her hands inside her heavy leather gloves were blistered and raw. The shaft was pitch black, silent, except for their ragged breathing and the sharp clack-clack of the metal ascenders biting into the rope. Every time Abigail looked down into the void beneath her boots, a wave of dizzying vertigo threatened to pull her off the rope. But every time she wanted to quit, she pictured Richard raising a glass of champagne in Cyprus. She pushed up, she stepped, she climbed. At 4:15 a.m., they reached the concrete cap of the decommissioned shaft, the 41st floor. Abigail hauled herself onto the narrow maintenance ledge, her chest heaving, her muscles trembling violently. Silas collapsed beside her, wheezing, his forehead pressed against the cold concrete. They rested for 5 minutes in total silence. Above us is the plenum space, Abigail whispered, pointing her red light at a grated ventilation panel in the ceiling. It runs between the 41st floor ceiling and the 42nd floor floorboards. We crawl through the ductwork, pop the vent in the executive men's restroom, and we're on Richard's floor. Getting through the vent was terrifyingly loud in the silent building. The screech of rusted screws yielding to Silas's multi-tool sounded like a siren to Abigail's hypersensitive ears. But they slipped through the opening, dropping silently onto the pristine, polished marble floor of the executive restroom. Abigail stood up, catching her reflection in the gilded mirror above the sinks. She barely recognized the woman staring back. Gone was the polished, manicured architect in designer silk. The woman in the glass was pale, her cheekbones sharp, her hair tied back in a messy knot, dressed in a faded black tactical sweater and covered in century-old coal dust. She looked like a ghost, And in many ways, she was. "Let's go," she breathed. They slipped out into the carpeted hallway of the 42nd floor. The corridor was illuminated only by emergency exit signs, casting long, eerie, green shadows across the mahogany doors. Abigail led the way, moving with the silent, deliberate steps she had perfected in the subway tunnels. They reached the heavy, double-oak doors of the corner suite. The brass plaque that used to read Sullivan Wealth Management had been unceremoniously pried off, leaving an ugly, scarred rectangle in the wood. A heavy electronic maglock secured the handle, complete with a blinking red LED, accompanied by a bright yellow FBI seizure notice taped across the seam. Abigail pulled Arthur's homemade RFID cloner from her pocket, a messy jumble of wires and a copper coil taped to a battery pack. 10 seconds, Arthur said. Silas muttered, watching the hallway. "Do it." Abigail pressed the coil against the card reader and flipped the toggle switch. The device hummed loudly. The lock's red light flickered, turned green, and emitted a heavy, mechanical clack. She turned the handle and pushed the door open. They were in. Richard's office was exactly as she remembered designing it, yet it felt entirely alien. The massive floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying, panoramic view of the sleeping city, a sea of glittering diamonds stretching out toward the dark expanse of the harbor. The expensive leather sofas, the custom-built mahogany bookshelves, the sprawling executive desk. It was all perfectly preserved, frozen in time by the federal injunction. Abigail felt a sudden, suffocating wave of panic. This was the epicenter of the lie. This was where Richard had smiled at her over takeout sushi while simultaneously forging her signature to destroy her life. "Focus, Abby," Silas whispered, sensing her hesitation. He checked his watch. "We have 20 minutes before the 5 a.m. Security patrol sweeps the upper elevator banks. Where is this phantom safe?" Abigail snapped back to reality. She walked past the grand desk and approached the eastern wall. It was covered in intricate, dark wood wainscoting, featuring hand-carved rosettes at the corners of each rectangular panel. "When I renovated this space, I discovered an old pneumatic tube dispatch line that ran straight down to the building's central mailroom," Abigail explained, running her gloved fingers over the polished wood. The system was dead, but the iron tube itself was embedded in the load-bearing masonry. Richard wanted a drop safe that wouldn't show up on a ground-penetrating radar scan, so I capped the tube inside the wall. She stopped at the third panel from the window. "It's this one." To anyone else, it looked like a solid wall, but Abigail knew the secret architecture. She pressed her thumbs firmly against the center of the carved wooden rosette on the top right corner of the panel, applying exactly 15 pounds of pressure, then twisted it a quarter turn counterclockwise. A soft click echoed in the silent room. The entire wooden panel popped forward slightly. Silas wedged his fingers into the gap and pulled. The panel swung open on hidden hinges, revealing a dark, cylindrical cavity lined with cold iron. At the bottom of the cavity, resting on a custom-fitted velvet pad, was a heavy, waterproof Pelican micro case. Abigail's breath hitched. She reached inside and pulled the heavy black box free. She set it on Richard's desk and popped the heavy latches. Inside rested 2 items. The first was exactly what the FBI had been desperately hunting for: a custom, military-grade, encrypted, solid-state hard drive, the master ledger, the map to the offshore millions, and the indisputable proof of Richard's unilateral fraud. "You did it," Silas breathed, a rare smile breaking across his face. "You actually did it, Preston. That drive clears your name." But Abigail wasn't looking at the drive. She was staring at the second item in the box. It was a thick manila envelope, sealed with red wax. Printed on the front, in Richard's sharp, arrogant handwriting, was a single word: contingency. Frowning, Abigail broke the wax seal and slid the contents onto the desk. A stack of densely printed legal documents and bank transfer receipts spilled out under the beam of her flashlight. She began to read the top page, and as her eyes scanned the text, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The floor fell out from under her. "What is it?" Silas asked, noticing the color drain entirely from her face. He didn't do it alone, Abigail whispered, her voice trembling. Richard didn't have the real estate connections to launder this kind of volume. He needed legitimate construction projects to wash the stolen funds through fake vendor invoices. She flipped through the pages, her heart pounding a sickening rhythm against her ribs. The documents were partnership agreements, offshore wire authorizations, and heavily redacted emails. Who was his partner? Silas asked, leaning over the desk. Abigail pointed a shaking finger at the signature line on a $5 million transfer receipt routed through a shell company in the Cayman Islands. The name printed beneath the scrawled signature was clear as day. David Davies, Managing Director, Hudson River Holdings. David, Abigail gasped, stepping back from the desk as if the papers were radioactive. Chloe's husband. The pieces slammed together with brutal, devastating clarity. Chloe Davies hadn't blocked Abigail's number out of fear of social contagion or innocent self-preservation. Chloe had cut her off because she and David were actively complicit in the theft of Abigail's life. David had provided the clean real estate projects to wash Richard's dirty money, and when the house of cards collapsed, Richard fled, leaving Abigail to take the fall, while David and Chloe quietly kept their millions, protected by the illusion of their pristine reputation. They knew, Abigail choked out, tears of pure fury burning her eyes. My best friend. She watched me lose my home. She watched the press tear me apart. She let me go to a homeless shelter, knowing her husband helped steal every dime. Abby? Silas hissed urgently, grabbing her shoulder. Look, he pointed toward the heavy oak doors of the office. Through the frosted glass panels flanking the entrance, the distinct, sweeping beam of a high-powered flashlight cut through the darkness of the hallway. Heavy footsteps thudded against the carpet. The 5 a.m. patrol was early. Hey, Frank? The seal on suite 4200 is broken. A gruff voice echoed from the corridor. We need to go. Right now, Silas commanded. He grabbed the solid-state drive and the dossier, shoving them into his canvas backpack. We can't go back through the ceiling vent. They'll hear us in the plenum. The window, Abigail said, her architectural mind overriding her shock, operating on pure adrenaline. Are you insane? Silas Whisper yelled. We are 42 stories up. Not outside, Abigail said, rushing toward the massive floor-to-ceiling glass. She pointed to the heavy bronze mullions, separating the window panes. This is a Cass Gilbert building. These aren't just windows. They are part of a continuous vertical egress channel used for the original exterior window washing rigs. The bronze casing is hollow. She pulled the heavy metal rebar from her belt and slammed it into the side of the bronze casing. The metal dented. She hit it again, harder, the noise deafening in the office. The handle to the office door rattled violently. Hey, who's in there? Federal property. Open up, the guard shouted. Abigail swung a third time, prying the bronze casing open. A narrow, terrifyingly dark, vertical shaft was revealed, dropping straight down into the guts of the building's exterior wall. A heavy steel maintenance ladder was bolted to the inside. Go! Abigail shoved Silas toward the opening. He squeezed into the shaft, immediately beginning his descent. Abigail threw one last look at Richard's desk, the scene of her ruin and her resurrection, before slipping into the bronze cavity. She pulled the heavy casing shut behind her just as the heavy oak doors to the office burst open. Clear the room, a voice shouted. Flashlight beams swept across the empty executive suite, illuminating the open wall panel and the abandoned Pelican case. Inside the exterior wall, suspended above a 40-story drop, Abigail Preston clung to the rusted ladder in the pitch black. She pressed her face against the cold steel, listening to the muffled shouts of the guards mere inches away. Her muscles screamed, her hands bled, and her lungs burned for air. But as she began the long, dark descent back into the subterranean world, she wasn't the broken woman who had crawled into the dirt 8 months ago. She possessed the ledger, she possessed the truth, and she possessed a newfound, terrifying purpose. Richard Sullivan and David Davies thought they had buried her. They didn't realize They had only planted a seed, and now the architect was ready to design her revenge. The descent back into the subterranean world was a blur of burning muscles and cold terror. By the time Abigail and Silas collapsed onto the damp concrete of the City Hall steam tunnels, the sun was already rising over Manhattan, casting a gray, unforgiving light through the street-level grates. They had survived the vertical drop, but the true weight of what they had stolen was just beginning to settle. When they finally returned to the F-line spur, Abigail laid the waterproof Pelican case on her scavenged wooden workbench. She stared at the encrypted hard drive and the manila envelope as if they were unexploded ordnance. "We have it," Silas rasped, wiping coal dust from his forehead. "The golden ticket. Hand that over to the feds, and you get your life back, Abby." "No," Abigail said quietly, her eyes locked on David Davies' signature. "If I walk into an FBI field office, they'll arrest me as a flight risk. They'll confiscate the drive, bury it in a bureaucratic black hole, and meanwhile, David and Chloe will use their wealth to quietly dismantle the proof. I can't just be innocent. I have to be the architect of their execution." They took the drive to Arthur Penhaligon deep in the City Hall loop. Arthur took one look at the military-grade solid-state drive and chuckled. "Abby, that's AES 256 hardware encryption. It would take a supercomputer 3 million years to brute force it." "I don't need a supercomputer. I just need to know Richard's ego," Abigail replied. "Try this mnemonic based on the projects I completed for him. TRIBECA 2019 WOO LEL WORTHVAULT. Arthur typed it in. A soft chime echoed through the vaulted station. The screen flooded with data. Thousands of offshore shell companies, dummy corporations, and unredacted communications between Richard Sullivan and David Davies. "Mother of God," Arthur whispered, scrolling through a ledger detailing a $40 million laundering operation disguised as a luxury condo development. "They defrauded the state pension fund. This is a nuclear bomb. Then let's detonate it," Abigail said. She compiled a massive digital dossier, setting a dead man's switch to email Assistant U.S. Attorney Thomas Kessler, the Wall Street Journal, and the federal bankruptcy judge at exactly 9 p.m. the following night. But she needed a physical trap to ensure David couldn't buy his way out. The next evening, the surface of Lower Manhattan was a glittering spectacle. Inside a massive, climate-controlled tent, billionaires and politicians sipped champagne, celebrating David Davies' groundbreaking gala for a new financial district high-rise. 50 feet below them, in the damp darkness of the foundation pit, Abigail Preston waited. She was dressed in a sharp, tailored black suit she had thrifted that afternoon. At 8:45 p.m., using a cloned contractor radio, Abigail tapped into the event security frequency. "Mr. Davies to the sublevel foundation command trailer. We have a massive hydrostatic pressure breach on the western retaining wall." David excused himself from the party and took the construction elevator down into the dark foundation pit, fully expecting to berate an incompetent site manager. When the doors opened, the site was empty. "Hello, David," Abigail's voice echoed from the shadows. She stepped into the halogen light. David froze, genuine shock cracking his polished facade. "Abby? Good God. You look like a corpse. The feds are turning the eastern seaboard upside down for you." His shock quickly hardened into a cruel sneer. "You're insane. I could have you shot for trespassing before the police even arrive." "You could," Abigail agreed calmly, stepping closer. "But that wouldn't stop the U.S. attorney from reading the master ledger." David blanched. "The ledger is gone. Richard destroyed it." "Richard kept it inside a pneumatic tube in the Woolworth building," Abigail corrected, enjoying the absolute terror blooming in his eyes, along with a contingency envelope. "It seems Richard didn't trust you, David. He kept every receipt, every forged invoice, every email you sent, coordinating the money wash." "You're lying," David breathed, his trembling hands betraying his panic. He lunged at her, driven by the desperate panic of a cornered animal. Abigail didn't flinch. From the shadows behind a concrete pillar, Silas Caldwell stepped forward. He swung the heavy, rusted iron rebar he carried and slammed it directly into David's kneecap. The billionaire crumpled to the dirt floor with a shrieking gasp. "You don't touch the architect?" Silas growled. Above them, a chorus of sirens began to cut through the humid night air, converging on the construction site. Flashing red and blue lights bled through the grating above the foundation pit. Abigail looked down at the writhing man. At exactly 9 o'clock, which was 3 minutes ago, a decrypted, unredacted copy of that hard drive was delivered to the press and the AUSA. "Welcome to the bottom, David." She turned and walked toward the dark, gaping mouth of the Cortlandt Street access tunnel. Silas right behind her, slipping away, just as FBI tactical teams pounded down the stairs. The fallout was biblical. By morning, the Wall Street Journal ran the exclusive story of the decade. AUSA Kessler moved with ruthless efficiency. David Davies was arrested and denied bail. Chloe Davies's assets were immediately frozen, forcing her to flee in disgrace. In Cyprus, local authorities raided Richard Sullivan's villa and dragged him onto an extradition flight back to New York in handcuffs. 3 days later, Abigail Preston walked up the steps of the federal courthouse. A federal judge formally exonerated her, reinstating her frozen accounts and returning her stolen assets. Abigail reclaimed her wealth, but she never returned to the Tribeca penthouse. Instead, she founded the Caldwell Initiative, a heavily funded, fiercely private nonprofit dedicated to providing medical care and structural sanctuary for New York's subterranean homeless. Silas became her chief director of operations. Abigail eventually returned to architecture, but her designs changed. She stopped building monuments to corporate vanity, choosing instead to design spaces of refuge. She knew better than anyone that the true strength of a structure isn't measured by how high it reaches into the sky, but by the depth and resilience of its hidden foundation.